Hello everyone. We have got to chapter 6 of 1 Timothy and we're coming to the end of the letter now, and Paul is wrapping everything up that he wants to say in this last chapter. So a couple of things just to remember, that this letter is to Timothy, but it's also intended to be circulated around to the whole church. It's a way of reinforcing Timothy's authority across the churches in Ephesus, and also a way of giving them practical guidelines for how to live out their new Christian lives. I want to try and divide the chapter into 3 sections, which hopefully is going to help you to discuss it, and you might want to stop the recording at various points to discuss the questions as we go along, or you can tackle them all at the end. So here goes. So the first section I wanted to look at is verse 1 and 2. In chapter 5, Paul has been talking about lots of different groups of people in the church, and in chapter 6 he moves on to talking about another group in verses 1 and 2, the slaves. So really it's impossible to talk fully about slavery here and what it meant in the early church, but I just wanted to quote from a commentary by a man called Ellicott, who said that, talking about slavery, he said it was perhaps the most perplexing of all the questions Christianity had to face, this one of slavery. It entered into all grades and ranks. It was common to all peoples and nations. The very fabric of society seemed knit and bound together with this miserable institution. War and commerce were equally responsible. It was indeed the curse of the world. Paul calls it a yoke, but it was nevertheless a situation to which the gospel had to apply. So the first thing to say is that that word slave means everything from across the spectrum, from slave to servant, anyone in any kind of subservient relationship. So many slaves had become Christians, as well as many masters. Christianity had exploded onto the scene, and church leaders had to speak into this situation. Paul's focus is on the attitude of the heart. He's expressing the idea that the law of love is higher than the law of employment or trade. He's expressing the idea that slavery itself is not a root, but a fruit of a society which needs heart change on every level. And the key ideas, I think, here in these first 2 verses are as follows. Don't disrespect those who have authority over you. Don't have a bad attitude to your masters or employers because they're not Christians. If your bosses are Christians, don't take advantage of them. We need to represent Jesus by how we work, and not to create a situation where God is criticised because of our poor work ethic. So questions really to think about just for this first section are, how do these verses apply to us today? And are there any ways in which our behaviour in the workplace or in a place where we are serving could bring God's name into disrepute? Okay, on to the second section, which is verse 3 up to verse 10. So in this section, Paul returns to the theme of false teaching, which was clearly a big concern. In verse 4, he identifies the root of this behaviour as pride. From the root of this tree grow such things as friction, malicious talk, deception, jealousy, suspicion, and using the gospel for profit. Pride is really idolatry. It is placing ourselves as our own God, putting our own agenda above God's, with terrible, terrible consequences. 2 Timothy 3:2 says, I can just turn to it. It says, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, holy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. So these are elements Paul was seeing in the church. He saw that pride amongst these false teachers meant that they might know the word really well but not submit to it. In verse 6, he gives the antidote, a way to gain. He talks about an absence of pride, an absence of self-aggrandizement or ambition, and recognizing that all we have is God's anyway. So the idea, the way I tried to visualize this was like a tree, that there's this one root which Paul has been talking about of pride, and that has it grows and various horrible fruit results. And he then goes on to talk about another kind of tree. Another root of a tree. And this tree, this root is called the love of money. And it also produces all kinds of bad fruit. Things like loss of faith, misdirection, injury, wandering, and lots of grief. He mentions that at the bottom of that, at the end of that section there in verse 10. And I drew a little cartoony thing, which hopefully you're going to be able to see on the screen to kind of illustrate how I was thinking about this section of the text. I just want to read another little verse from Philippians, just as a way of getting us to think and discuss some things about this section of the text. In Philippians 4:11 it says, I am not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. And I really like this idea that Paul had to learn how to be content. So my question is, in our consumer culture, how can we truly learn to live contented lives? And my other question for this section is that pride and the love of money are listed by Paul here as two roots of evil or roots of sin. How do we recognise and deal with those roots in our own lives? So the third section of this chapter runs from verse 11 onwards. I seem to have lost it now. Where Paul says, but you, man of God. Obviously talking about Timothy, but also, I think, talking to all of us. Paul saying, run away from all these things, from these roots of sin, which cause all kinds of bad fruit. Run away from that, turn away from that, and turn towards the things of God. He uses very strong, active verbs and adjectives here. Pursue, fight, take hold. They're all action-packed, all suggesting a lot of effort. The fruit that we have to produce is righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, and gentleness, which all sounds quite similar to the fruits of the Spirit. In verse 12, he says, we're going to be in this fight, and it's a hard fight, and we're going to have to keep fighting until Jesus comes back. So it's going to be a fight where we have to really endure. We can't give up. And we have a great example in Jesus, Paul tells Timothy. He gives Timothy this serious charge. He says, keep this command without spot or blame. And the command is, fight the good fight of the faith. That's a tough challenge for Timothy, I think. The final 3 verses of this section, to me, seem almost like a PS after Paul has finished the letter at the end of verse 17, I think it is, 16. 17 onwards is almost like a PS, a couple of things he just wants to reiterate again, in case anyone's missed it, talking about people who love money, and also talking about false teaching again. And at the very end of the letter, he addresses Timothy by saying, Timothy, guard what has been entrusted to your care. Again, restating Timothy's authority over the church, and also asking him to really take seriously the call of God, the way that God has asked him to take care of this church and to look after it. So my questions in this section are, firstly, how do we fight the good fight of the faith? And secondly, what has God entrusted to your care, and how do you guard it? Thanks a lot for listening, and I hope you enjoy discussing these things in your group.